Committee will come to order. In his January 19, 2018 remarks on the National Defense Strategy, Secretary Mattis warned that, quote, "Our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare, air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, and it is continuing to erode," end quote. Now, much of that erosion has been caused by things we've done to ourselves. Sequestration and continuing resolutions come to mind. But part of the erosion in our competitive edge is the result of adversaries and competitors obtaining American technology and intellectual property by legal and often illegal means. In its January 2018 report, China's Technology Transfer Strategy, DIUX, found that the People's Republic of China, for example, uses a variety of methods to obtain U.S. technology, including industrial espionage, where China is by far the most aggressive country operating in the U.S., cyber theft on a massive scale, deploying hundreds of thousands of Chinese Army professionals, academia, since 25% of U.S. STEM graduate students are Chinese foreign nationals, China's use of open source information, cataloging foreign innovation on a large scale, Chinese-based technology transfer organizations, U.S.-based associations sponsored by the Chinese government to recruit talent, and technical expertise on how to do deals learned from U.S. firms. That report noted that the cost of stolen intellectual property has been estimated at $300 billion a year. Most alarming, DIUX found that, again, I'll quote, "The U.S. does not have a comprehensive policy or the tools to address this massive technology transfer to China, and the U.S. government does not have a holistic view of how fast this technology transfer is occurring, the level of Chinese investment in U.S. technology, or what technologies we should be protecting." That's the end of the quote. Now, I understand that the DIUX report is just one report, but based on everything this committee has learned and heard about over the course of this year, those conclusions sound right to me, and it should be alarming.
We somehow, in the years since the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved, we believed that great power competition was behind us. The National Defense Strategy, released this past January, makes a very clear set of points that we have returned to an era of great power competition, and we must treat it as such. When we believed throughout the several decades of the Cold War, when we believed we were in a great power competition for not only the hearts and minds of the world, but possibly our very existence, we treated all the matters that you're talking about, state, education, commerce, treasury, we treated all of that as if it were of existential importance, which it was. Today, we treat these individual matters, these matters as if they were individual matters, and I think what you're hearing from us is that they are not isolated issues, that they need to be treated in the large. As I was starting to answer to Mr. Gallego's question earlier, we as a nation have choices. Do we wish to admit, as we have today, 30,000 Chinese PhD students in STEM areas? Do we wish to do that? Do we think the benefits outweigh the gains? There is not a national decision in that regard as there was when we were competing against the Soviet Union. We didn't do those things. It's not for me to say whether we should or should not. I'm trying to put on the table that these apparently isolated decisions, in fact, when taken together, comprise a whole of government strategy that we do not have. I know there have been breaches. We had reference to that earlier on today of actual classified information. But I will go on record, sir, as saying that I believe this hearing and our witness statements and responses to questions are more about the amalgamated effect of the industrial base and technology levels as a whole, not whether or not a particular exfiltration attempt by the Chinese was successful in a particular case, but rather the whole pattern of Chinese investment in our industrial base, extraction of data, predatory joint ventures, predatory trade practices, the whole spectrum of Chinese adversarial behavior with respect to our economic and industrial base. I believe that's actually the larger concern, sir.
All right.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the debate about whole government approach, I'm just concerned that you throw the term around like it's candy at a parade, because at the same time you've testified that one of you did, that Belt Road Initiative is problematic for U.S. policy. At the same time you testify that our Department of Commerce is holding bi-monthly meetings with U.S. companies and the U.S. Embassy in China to figure out ways for those U.S. companies to access projects in the Belt Road Initiative. At the same time, you talk about a whole government approach. I'm not asking you to be experts on trade or TPP, but to have some concept of what the argument was on trade Trans-Pacific Partnership and how it fit into leveraging U.S. economic policy and strength in Asia vis-a-vis China. Just that basic understanding would be helpful for you all. And so I don't think you're talking about a whole government approach. I think you may be talking about a whole Pentagon approach. So if there is a whole government approach, I would like to know, not from you today, but just another example. If we're in an era of great power competition, you talk about the last one we had, and we're not doing those things we did today that we did in the last one. Well, in the last one we had, we fought for open markets. We put human rights near the top of the list when we talked to North Korea. And we're not doing that today, so does that not apply to this era of great power competition? So again, I think you're throwing the term around to try to make it sound like you're doing it, but I don't think you are, and you need to get on it. You need to have a mechanism. If we only had a National Security Council mechanism that could develop a whole government approach that's used by the White House, then we might have one. So that's, I usually don't give speeches. I usually ask questions in my 5 minutes, but it's been frustrating to hear this term being thrown around, again, like candy at a 4th of July parade, and I don't think you're living up to it. So.
And China's technology transfer mechanisms are paired with Beijing's parallel strategy of military-civilian fusion that expands civil-military integration of defense and industrial bases to facilitate the construction of a national infrastructure connecting the PLA, state-owned defense research, development, and manufacturing enterprises, and government agencies under the State Council, universities, and private sector firms. We assess that these collaborative partnerships have well supported Beijing's rapid military modernization. So what are the possible long-term consequences? Well, while the most immediate and visible effects may be related to particular military technologies, the long-term consequences could be much broader. A decline of the United States' advantage in key technology could affect our ability to set global norms and regulations for technology, control access to technology for military purposes, and reap the economic benefits we derive from commercialization. If the U.S. were to lose its technological edge, the associated loss of influence would have far-reaching implications beyond scientific disciplines to include economic, social, political, and security dynamics.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here on this very, very important topic. There was a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine that discussed how China has created a sophisticated state surveillance system with facial recognition technology, specifically to target minorities and what they call anti-China behavior. And they developed this system with the help of Chinese surveillance firms like Hikvision. Now, Hikvision is about 42% owned by the Chinese government, and the chairman of Hikvision's board was quoted as saying that the board must ensure the company, quote, creates a state-owned enterprise and that it remains, quote, under direct control of the Communist Party Central Committee. In fact, Hikvision received $3 billion line of credit from the state-owned China Development Bank, and this is one of the three so-called policy banks whose financing objectives follow political motives. And I'm sure you can imagine that I was alarmed when I learned that Hikvision cameras were operated at a military installation in my district. The cameras have since been removed, but I am disturbed that the federal government willingly purchased these cameras knowing that China is actively engaged in espionage against the United States. So my question is, I'm deeply concerned that video surveillance and security equipment sold by Chinese companies exposes the U.S. government to significant vulnerabilities due to potential built-in backdoors, creating a video surveillance network for China purchased by the taxpayer and installed courtesy of the U.S. government. I would like each of you to discuss the security vulnerabilities posed by Chinese surveillance cameras and whether or not you believe it's a security risk to have them operating at U.S. government facilities. So, Mr. Schinella, you want to start?
Sure. That's everything you've laid out there is consistent with some of the threats which we tried to point the flashlight out in our opening statement. You've got essentially a state-owned or certainly state-invested company, and you've got an example of the sort of, you could characterize it as an insider threat, if you will, but the Chinese government's relationships with these kinds of companies, which have a worldwide commercial presence, poses exactly the sort of threat you've identified. And as my colleague articulated, it's also an indication of the different kind of world we had. We weren't buying surveillance cameras from the Soviet Union in those days, but when you've got Chinese companies making world-class equipment on a global market, they pose a threat that is different than we faced during the Cold War.
And ma'am, if I might, it's obviously a concern and something that we're actively working. There are other additional examples like that that we'd happy to take you through in a classified setting to discuss similar vulnerabilities that we've identified and then what we're doing to remediate them.
Be great.
And Ms. Hartzell, if I can also just add, going back to the supply chain discussion we had and the policies associated with that and the congressional engagement and the direction that you all provided us, there are three areas of the supply chain I worry about. It's going through the front door, the cyber exfiltration, and us making it easy for them. It's two, it's exactly what you highlighted. It's the backdoor piece. But then third, there's also the counterfeit part piece. And we need to be able to look holistically at all of those and mitigate threats along all three of those vectors, which the authorization you provided us helps us to start doing.
Okay. Mr. Griffin, you have anything to add?
Shockingly for me, I have nothing useful to add. Thank you, ma'am.
You bet. Mr. Schinella and also Mr. Griffin, you mentioned in your comments concerns about the universities and the Chinese using the universities. That's something I'm very concerned as well. The National Intelligence Council, you provided us with this chart that shows the different programs that China has in talent recruitment, and of the snapshot that is provided here, approximately 2/3 of these individuals worked or studied in the U.S. and are employed in China in areas such as defense, research, technology, state-owned enterprises, academia, and things. Now, Mr. Griffin, you said it's not up to me to give a recommendation, so I'll ask Mr. Schinella. Do you think we should change our visa system to deny Chinese students be able to participate in PhD programs?
Well, as part of the U.S. intelligence community, it's even less my mandate to make policy recommendations, but as the intelligence product you have illustrates, and as my opening remarks indicated, China through a state-directed policy, absolutely, is trying to make the most licit and illicit, but often through absolutely legal mechanisms, exploitation of their ability to take advantage of the U.S. university system.
Thank you. Time's up.
Mr. Bacon. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Griffin, I, along with 25 members of Congress this week, sent a bicameral and bipartisan letter to the Secretary of Education on, earlier this week on Tuesday that expressed our concern about Huawei's links to the Chinese government. Huawei has so-called, quote, research partnerships with over 50 U.S. universities and is likely using these relationships to exploit the open and transparent culture of our schools and communities, as well as gain access to critical next-generation technologies. We know that China has used relationships like these for spying, conducting cyber attacks, and committing industrial and economic espionage. Meanwhile, the DoD policy that governs technology transfer is dated back to 1999. At that point, we had no idea what an iPhone was. We were worried about Y2K, and the USB flash drive wasn't even invented. The world, as I'm sure you would acknowledge, is very different technologically now than it was 19 years ago. So, Dr. Griffin, considering the emerging nature of strategic competition with China and the increasing need to protect our critical investments in both academic and private partnerships, what is the DoD doing to protect the DoD-funded research from foreign threats and unvetted members with uncertain loyalties? And what specifically are you doing to assist the Secretary of Education in mitigating risk to universities and other schools and help the federal government to protect and advance the United States technological advantage?
Sir, that's a bigger question than I believe I can answer here for the record. I think Eric might be more capable than I. I share your concern. I've several times alluded in this hearing to the number and, in fact, the existence of so many Chinese STEM students in the United States. I completely share your concern, and it's well documented that this is an avenue of access for the Chinese that we'd not want them to have. Beyond that, I don't have any detail for you. Eric?
Aside, before we move to Eric, are you too concerned about the dollars that fund academic research on universities in America that on our behalf are engaged in classified research for DoD?
I am concerned that
that have ties to Huawei and other
I am concerned that we are not yet as vigilant as we should be about making sure that that research doesn't go to places that have those ties. Certainly, universities have a very long, multi-decade history of collaboration with the national security community writ large on problems of national interest. It's one of our greatest strengths. But doing so in an environment that can be penetrated by adversaries is not wise, and we are looking more closely at that.
So, Mr. Chewning, you would agree that we're not as vigilant as we should be, as Dr. Griffin
Yeah, no, I
said?
agree 100%. We are concerned. We are reviewing the contract language associated with those research projects at the universities. And I think more broadly, this hits on the hard issue of we have an open innovation model, and we have an adversary that's within that model and operates a closed model on their own side, and that we need to experiment to find what the structural fix is for that without breaking what makes our system work best in the world.
Are either of you aware at all of any interest by the U.S. Department of Education in these ties or this subject at large? Have you had any conversations with any leaders at the Department of Education?
I have not. I would be happy to do so, but I personally have not. And of course, another difference between now and 1999, which you cited, was that China had not been admitted to the World Trade Organization in 1999. And I might make the point that that was truly a seminal branch point that allows many of the types of intrusions of which you speak.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Let me follow up with just one question for Mr. Shinella and probably Ms. Bingen. As a practical matter for our purposes, should we see any distinction between a Chinese company and the Chinese government? So if a Chinese company is investing in some technology, some business, something going on, as a practical matter for our purposes, should we see that as the Chinese government doing it?
I would say there's a gradation, but whether you've got a wholly owned, state-owned company that essentially is an element of the Chinese government, or largely a genuinely private company that the Chinese government still has leverage over back within China, there may be a spectrum of risk, but I would say that at no point on that spectrum is the risk zero.
Okay. Ms. Bingen, you have anything to add?
Mr. Chairman, I just add the China National Intelligence Law from 2017 says that all organizations and citizens shall support, cooperate with, and collaborate in national intelligence work.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought.